Hello, and welcome to the Evercore ISI Aemetis Coverage Initiation Follow-Up Discussion webinar. Speaking today from Evercore ISI will be Midstream Research Director Todd Firestone, and for Aemetis Inc., its founder, chairman, and CEO, Eric McAfee. I'd like to remind everyone that the material in this webinar is based upon information considered to be reliable, but neither Evercore ISI nor its affiliates guarantee its completeness or accuracy. Assumptions, opinion, and recommendations contained herein are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not necessarily indicative of future performance. This material is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security, and we will not be disclosing any non-public information. Our speakers will be taking questions via the questions window on your webinar control panel. Please type your questions in at any time during the presentation. And now I'll turn the microphone over to Todd Firestone.
Great, thanks, Diane. Appreciate it. Everyone, really appreciate you coming on and spending a little bit of time this afternoon. We're really excited to have the CEO of Aemetis on. As you know, we've had a conversation with Eric McAfee before. He's a really dynamic leader in this industry, really a pioneer in bringing kind of renewable fuel production to California and to the United States. So, really thank him for coming on. As always, you can type in the questions in the dialogue box. We'll get to those. So, we can ask Eric directly. But what we're going to first do is start off. Eric, I thought I'd give you a couple minutes to just high level for investors who haven't spent a lot of time looking at Aemetis, give them a little high level of what the company does.
Good. Thanks, Todd, and thanks for the opportunity for everybody to spend a little time today. We are going to be talking off of a presentation that's on the homepage of Aemetis. So at aemetis.com, at the bottom of the first page is the Aemetis corporate presentation. So if you happen to want to download that and follow along, we'll be referring to a couple of those slides. Starting out with slide 3. Aemetis means one prudent wisdom, and our mission is to replace high carbon intensity petroleum products with actually below zero renewable fuels, not just zero carbon or positive carbon, but below zero carbon intensity, with the goal of reversing climate change, which is caused by greenhouse gases. The strategy is strongly supported by the financial support of the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, the U.S. Federal Renewable Fuel Standard, and the IRS 45Q carbon sequestration credits, as well as other mandates and policies. But in general, the activity we do is not just a subjective sort of ESG measurement. We actually financially, every day in selling our biofuels, get paid every day for the carbon reduction investments we've made. And on slide 4, our overall strategy is to be a participant, hopefully a leader, in what we believe to be the third generation technology, which reverses climate change as its goal. And we think this is a 100-year mega trend that investors will increasingly see the economic rewards of participating in. First generation renewable energy basically just uses solar energy. So we're talking about solar, wind, hydroelectric. These do not absorb carbon from the atmosphere, but they offset us using more carbon from the ground. So instead of building another coal powered electricity plant, we use solar to offset the coal. The second generation of renewable energy uses the sun's energy, but also absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere. So this would be all of the renewable fuels, renewable diesel, ethanol, biodiesel, sustainable aviation fuel. All of these would fit into second generation renewable energy, where now, not just using solar energy, but also absorbing CO2, we're reducing the amount of CO2 that we're pulling out of the ground in the form of petroleum and coal and petroleum natural gas. But we're actually absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. But we're still emitting the CO2 during the production of these fuels back into the atmosphere. So third generation renewable energy uses solar energy, absorbs, but also sequesters carbon. So we act as a siphon of carbon from the atmosphere, using that carbon to make productive fuels and chemicals, but then sequester, keep in long-term storage, either underground or in cement or some other sequestering methodology, And in essence, we are now a siphon of carbon from the atmosphere into sequestered CO2. It's the opposite of what the entire petroleum-based fuel business is, and frankly, the utility industries that are using coal and petroleum natural gas. So the California LCFS, the federal RFS, and IRS 45Q regimes financially reward third generation renewable energy, which is carbon negative, very substantially. And so we built our business around the opportunities that are generated by going into carbon negative fuels. And the one that we have highlighted recently is our biogas business opportunity. And we're by capturing carbon in the form of methane, CH4 is 4 hydrogens, 1 carbon in a molecule. When that CH4 ends up in the atmosphere, it's approximately 84 times better at capturing heat than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over its first life cycle. And so if you can take methane, destroy it before it goes into the atmosphere, and instead emit CO2, there's a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's exactly what our dairy biogas business does. It has a negative 426 carbon intensity by converting methane into CO2 by turning it into a fuel. It's displacing diesel in trucks. And so we, as a business, have undertaken the conversion of our ethanol plant into a very low carbon intensity plant, and then taken the inputs to our plant, which includes biogas as an input, and converting that to a carbon negative input instead of carbon positive from petroleum natural gas, and then taking the output, such as distillers corn oil, and turned it into the highest value product we can generate in the current market, which happens to be aviation fuel with carbon sequestration and renewable diesel with carbon sequestration. So our business model is just built around optimizing our existing ethanol plant, which is a 65 million gallon plant in California, probably the largest carbon market in the world for renewable fuels, and optimizing the inputs and outputs into pretty large projects, 52 dairies of biogas input, eventually 90 million gallons, 2 phases of renewable diesel and jet fuel production, and carbon sequestration for 2 million tons a year, are all just derivatives of exactly the same core variable, which is we are already the largest low carbon fuel standard ethanol credit producer in California. We're already the largest IRS 45Q reusable carbon CO2 producer in California. We're already the largest animal feed producer in California, 2 million pounds a day, feeding 80 dairies and 100,000 dairy cows every day. We already are, and have just basically developed a business model that expands that leading footprint we already have, taking advantage of our physical location in California.
That's great, Eric. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I think some of the investors are now getting more and more educated on Aemetis. Obviously, we just launched coverage as one of our top picks on Wednesday after market close. And some of the questions that have come in are basically, what's really the next catalyst without having to fly out to California for growth, especially let's just start with dairy. We can keep Riverbank on the side, but you've got 17 dairies over the next 2 years. You've got another expansion of 52 total by 2025. What do investors need to look for a catalyst this year?
Well, if people want to look at slide 15, you can see that we've already completed 2 dairies, and a 4-mile pipeline has been operating, generating revenue since September of last year. And we announced a couple months ago the California Environmental Quality Act permit. This is the hard one. The one that takes a long time to do. We announced we could, and so you'll see an announcement that we are selecting our contractor for that interface, and we are actually planning to start building that pipeline here in the 3rd quarter. And so that pipeline basically puts us down into the heart of dairy country. We supply over 80 dairies today, but our plan is to add another 15 dairies in the next 12 months. So that would take us from 2 to 17 dairies. and then over the next 48 months, so basically the next 36 months after that, to take ourselves from 17 dairies to 52 dairies. And the 52 does not represent all 80 that we supply. And there are many dairies we do not supply out of the 1,000 plus in California that our pipeline bypasses. So our strategy is put the pipeline in place. That entails what's called an encroachment permit. This is the county approving that we can put the pipeline down the side of their road. And once we put that pipeline in place, the county is reluctant to have a second biogas pipeline. And the reality of building a second pipeline is that all the large dairies have already been signed up with Aemetis and are already interconnected. So that kind of takes away a lot of financial incentive to ever put a second pipeline in place. So
Eric,
it's a first.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I makes sense. I think people get that. I think this other question people might have is, wow, maybe you could just shed a little light on the timing and also, is it like a regular development process? Is it a county kind of zoning use approval? And just internally, are you developing these internally and then constructing them, or you got third-party GCs to do this? Like, I think it's just kind of questions like that. Like, how are you marshaling the resources to actually put these things online?
Sure, no problem. We have built an in-house engineering, maintenance, and project development and finance team. So just like we already run a $150 million business in the ethanol business, we have built the same team for this business. We then contract with leading national pipeline companies to build the pipeline. We contract with outside engineering for the engineering design. We contract with outside permitting consultants for the local as well as the state permitting that we do. For financing, we have a $3 billion fund out of Toronto that we've used for bridge financing for the last 12 years and obtained a $30 million equity investment from them that's been fully deployed. We've made that entire investment already. And from this point on, it's basically all USDA Renewable Energy for America program, known as a REAP program, debt funding. That debt program is 80% of the project funding from REAP, 20% equity. So we've already invested 30 million. That's our 20% equity. On paper, we can loan another $120 million from the USDA at about 6% interest rate with a 20-year term, 2 years interest only, 18 years amortization. So very favorable interest rate and very favorable payment terms. And as most people know, for the last 14 years, we've had the former Secretary of the United States Department of Ag, Jack Block, as a member of our board of directors. And so we've worked closely with the USDA for a decade. And this is one of the projects that the USDA is actively engaged with us on supporting expansion. So in terms of milestones people should be looking for, they should be looking for press releases announcing the pipeline contractor. They should announce, we should see an announcement that we've broken ground on pipeline construction. We'll probably press release the encroachment permit with the county. It's not that big a deal. It's really perfunctory, but people are curious because they don't know, well, how do you get the physical real estate? Well, you get it from the county. It's a roadside. So we'll probably press release that because the questions we've gotten there. We have already signed all the dairies for the second phase. The participation agreements are all signed. So we probably won't announce every single dairy that we break ground on. There'll be 15 press releases in the next 6 months. I don't think that's necessary. We might announce that we have, we're going forward on 3 or 5 or something. We might bundle them together. It's a simple process of putting the pipeline in place and then 15 dirt moving activities. We're making a football field size pond and then putting 3 layers of liner, 2 below and 1 above, and then building a H2S unit. We've already announced the hard part. The easy part is what we're doing ahead. We've already shown we can do pipelines. We've got a 4-mile pipeline. We've already shown we can do digesters. We have 2 digesters. So that's the easy stuff. The hard part is the centralized gas cleanup hub, which we already broke ground. We've already started construction, and the PG&E interconnect, which is probably a 2-year process. We're now at the final stage of that. Literally the final stage is PG&E is coming in and installing their skid, but we've already had the skid fabricated and everything. That all happens over the next quarter, over the third quarter. and finalizing early the fourth quarter. Those are the press releases to watch. We've already announced we broke ground on the gas cleanup skid, and when you see the press release saying that's completed, the PG&E interconnect is in place, then we're already generating revenue because we own an ethanol plant. So we're getting all the low carbon fuel standard credits you can get off these two dairies. But what we'll start getting is a D3 federal RIN by putting it in the pipeline and then feeding trucks or putting it into our own fueling station that's being built at our plant here in the third quarter. So third quarter is ending construction for the key hub activities. And then fourth quarter it starts revenue generation from the entire project because of those key hub interconnects happening.
That's great. That's super detailed. And I know investors on the call will really appreciate that. What we like about the stock, I think, it's three things. One, it's the scalability is not what I would call out of control. Like you've done this before. You've got 2 plants already. The second phase seems a lot of reasonable expansion. And the third phase includes dairies that are only 50 out of 1,200 in California. That seems fantastic. What I think people haven't really focused on, and we talked about before, Eric, is really how integrated everything is, because I guess that goes to how you drive a negative 426 CI score. So maybe you could dive into that a little bit and explain really how beneficial that whole system your system is.
We started with a corn ethanol plant like every one of the other 210 in the United States. And our goal has been for 15 years to demonstrate how a corn ethanol plant can be transformed by changing its inputs, which are energy as well as feedstock inputs, and its outputs, which are corn oil, animal feed, and fuels, into being a core of a biorefinery circular economy. The word circular means the waste products don't just disappear into some landfill or some sewer somewhere. They actually are a source of some input you need somewhere else. Biogas is an excellent example of that. The carbon that is in biogas originally was in the atmosphere. It was absorbed into a plant material that made ethanol. 72% of that plant material, which is a corn kernel, made ethanol. The waste product was animal feed. Protein, fiber, oil is animal feed. We, every day, produce 2 million pounds of that animal feed as a byproduct of being the largest ethanol producer in California. So when we take that animal feed to 80 different dairies, feed 100,000 dairy cows, what comes out of that is biogas. But the carbon, the CO2 from that biogas originally was in the atmosphere. It was not petroleum or coal, petroleum, natural gas in the ground. So looking at the source of the carbon is very, very important when you talk about fuels. Well, if that cow is putting out biogas as a byproduct of the dairy, if we capture that biogas, we just captured our own CO2 is what we functionally did, and it came from the atmosphere. We then bring that back via pipeline to our plant, clean it up. What the regulators have said is that we now have renewable natural gas. It's called biogas when it's in its raw form. It's about 40% carbon dioxide. It has hydrogen sulfide in it and other things that are kind of nasty smelling things. We clean that out and you end up with a utility pipeline grade natural gas that came from renewable sources. So it's renewable natural gas. What the California federal and IRS guys have all said is we we replace diesel in trucks with that biogas. We are taking a carbon intensive polluting petroleum product where the carbon came out of the ground and replacing it with a cleaner burning carbon that came from the atmosphere. So the negative 426 has been a curiosity to a lot of investors. Well, how do you actually end up with a negative carbon intensity? Well, it's because when it was in this methane form coming out of the lagoon, it's CH4. That's 84 times more damaging in the atmosphere than CO2. When we put it in a truck and it combusts in the truck, what comes out of the truck tailpipe is carbon dioxide, 1/84th as much effectiveness at capturing heat energy in the atmosphere. So we've effectively destroyed methane and reduced greenhouse gas in the atmosphere as a result. And so the calculation is very economic, obviously, because instead of being positive 95 or so diesel carbon intensity, we're now driving trucks on negative 426 CI fuel.
How much is because you've from the ethanol plant, and you put off the feed for the dairy for the cows, how much does that increase your CI score in California from, I've seen other dairy RNG in the 300 range. Does that give you basically another 120 because of that self feeding kind of synergy?
Our negative 426 CI score, which is sort of in the middle of the what I would call advanced biogas producers in California. Some of the early biogas producers didn't have very efficient collection processes. In our particular case, we have very efficient collection processes and the protocols at the dairy for capturing manure, so you don't end up with other manure streams that actually continue to emit biogas. We're actually sort of in the middle. I would expect negative 426 to not be necessarily the best score in California, and we're sort of mid-range. I would expect to see other guys show up at 460, 480. Because they're learning the protocols that actually capture the methane, right. And that capturing efficiently is really what gives us the negative carbon score. Here's why. A given cow puts out a certain amount of biogas per year by the math that the regulators have. If you're better at capturing that, then you're going to have a better carbon intensity, have a lower carbon intensity. If you're not so good at that, for a lot of reasons, the way that the washing process happens, et cetera, then your carbon score is not going to be as good.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind kind of answering what I would call a hard question for biofuels producers, and that bringing on incremental capacity. And so I think some of the not pushback, but feedback we got or concerns investors have is how do you underwrite competitive economics in a backwardated or kind of weakened or forward markets for RFS and LCFS credits. So if you underwrite, let's say where those were mid-cycle in the mid-teens, do those economics pencil out for you, or do they for dairy, not for renewable diesel? Maybe you could shed some light on that, because that is a question investors have repeatedly brought to me.
I think you could distill that down by saying if a lot of projects come on in renewable diesel and biogas, creating a lot of low carbon fuel standard credits, will the price of the credits decrease dramatically?
Yeah.
And fundamentally, I think what people are not pricing in potentially is that there's only a small group, that's a little committee over at the California Resources Board, that arbitrarily determined that 1.25% per year decrease from the year 2020 to 2030 was what they wanted, and they passed it in February 2019. And I'd say arbitrarily, they had a process, but it was just, hey, you know what? We think this is what could be achieved. Let's see. And at any given time, that little committee can get back together again and say, we're doing pretty well. Looks to me like we're actually getting a lot more LCFS credits, even though we've been in deficit now for over 3 years. If they see the the credit generation is starting to catch up, they have literally said their policy is to increase the percentage of decrease, basically go from 1.25% to 1.5% or even 2% decrease as the goals are achieved. And it's not like this has never happened before. They literally did this in February 2019 in order to create a more acceleration early in the program. Originally, it was not 1.25% in the early years. It accelerated, and they actually increased it. I've served for 26 years as a elected member of the board of directors of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. We're the largest business association in California, representing manufacturers, including all of the oil refineries, all of the aerospace companies, all of the automotive companies, all of the large food processors are members of the organization, over 500. And on the board of directors, I've served with the refinery managers for Exxon and Chevron, et cetera. And you can imagine we had a lot of interest in SB 32 and the resulting law, which is low carbon fuel standard. And it was actually negotiated with our associations sitting across the table from Governor Jerry Brown. And so these regulations were set up not that we were going to avoid a carbon tax. Essentially, this is a carbon tax. It was to have predictability. And so the actual deal was cut that it should be $200 per metric ton plus the cost of living index would be the price. Today, that's about $225 approximately. Yep. And so CARB itself has $200 plus cost of living index as a target price. And as we see sort of seasonal changes, and specifically in April, there's an auction that just almost guaranteed predictable that you're going to end up in the $170 range in April just for a couple of weeks. The CARB staff that we work with very closely are intently aware that if the prices fall too much, then everything they're trying to do goes away. Nothing gets funded. No renewable diesel, no renewable aviation fuel, no biogas, no carbon reduction, no employment, no investment. It all goes to zero. If it goes too high, the same thing happens. If it goes to, let's say, $300, the price of the pump spikes up, the politics with the political sport goes away, and amendments happen. That doesn't happen. So they know that there's a target range. And that target range is in the 180 to 220 range. And they've had committee meetings, Jim Duffy ran them at the CARB last August, saying, wow, we're butting up against the $220 limit. Let's have a committee meeting and let's talk about how we can give out additional LCFS credits because the price is going to get overheated. They literally just talked about more LCFS credits in the market to keep it from going above the $225 range. So they're intently aware of their role in giving a predictable price in the 180 to 220 range, and then moving up a little bit to 200 to 230 range, so that project developers such as ours can have commercial lenders, they're the number one audience, and then eventually institutional investors have confidence in the California policy. And they specifically understand the impact of the federal policy, which has had much less consistent commitment. And if you sit down with any member of the CARB staff, they will tell you that they understand the role of that price in funding growth in California.
That's great. I think that gives a lot of comfort for investors. I guess another question, kind of a corollary to that, is maybe two parts. Is one, what kind of gives you a heartburn on Riverbank, and are you able to kind of sell forward? And two, as all this capacity comes on, selling for the forward market looks like it's probably pretty thin. If that changes and becomes much more liquid, how does that change kind of the pricing? What do you think about that, especially for Riverbank, it seems like?
Well, Riverbank has two physical products we make, and then a couple of virtual products, the environmental attribute products, which would be the low carbon fuel standard in California, renewable fuel standard at federal level, and IRS 45Q. So if you really think about it, we produce 5 things at the plant. Let's talk about the physical products real quickly. Offtake agreements with airlines, offtake agreements with major oil companies take the physicals. And what we're producing in renewable diesel is diesel. It is not only renewable in that you get some of these environmental attributes, but the physical molecule is 50 billion gallons a year in the US. In California, 4 billion gallons of diesel in transportation every single year. And in pretty much no scenario are we going to run out of diesel in the United States, that we just don't have a market we can sell the diesel molecule into. Every single gallon of petroleum diesel would be replaced by renewable diesel because of the economics before you run out of a market. And that's just not, the physical delivery of diesel into a market is not really a risk for anybody. Aviation fuel, similar policies will drive the similar demand. 79 billion gallons per year of aviation fuel worldwide. The Europeans are the leaders in policy. We're kind of catching up to them here in the United States. But fundamentally, we can make 100% renewable diesel. And only at the time in which, let's say, a $1.50 tax credit passes and other things that support sustainable aviation fuel, do we need to just turn the dial, and up to 50% of our production can be sustainable aviation fuel. We don't have to produce any of it, but we can produce up to 50%. And we just the technology that we're implementing allows that discretion, literally, without having to do major disruption of the plant. You're almost dialing up and dialing down your production. And so the offtake agreements with airlines is their commitment to the business. But frankly, if for some reason policy changes, we don't have any minimums under those agreements. We can literally say, today we just make a lot more money selling to the trucker that's driving by our plant. And that flexibility is inherent in the fact that the policy for sustainable aviation fuel, I think, is still under development. Yeah. So those are the two physicals. Basically, have a 50 billion gallon diesel market you can ship into, 4 billion in California, and I don't anticipate that there's going to be a problem with the physicals at all. Now, attributes. IRS 45Q, there's no limit. You can do $10 billion of carbon sequestration tomorrow, and in the regulation, there's no limit to how many IRS 45Q credits you can get. Those are tax credits. There is a time frame. They're working on extending that time frame, et cetera, but there's no limit to the actual amount you could generate. And we're only talking about a few tens of millions of dollars, so it's not a huge deal there. The two big ones are going to be federal. That's the D3 RIN.
Yeah.
The D3 RIN mandate was 16 billion gallons of cellulosic fuel by the year 2022. The actual deliverable next year will probably be equivalent to about 400 million gallons. That might even be a little optimistic. So 16 billion with a B, 400 million with an M. We could produce a whole lot of biogas and never run out of D3 RINs. So in any scenario, cellulosic fuels, cellulosic ethanol, cellulosic biogas, because it comes from the cellulosic part of the plant, they're pretty much unlimited markets under the D3 RIN. That's $3.20 a gallon of value today, and that's pretty much unlimited. So we get back to LCFS, which is a conversation we just had with a bunch of regulators in California, thoroughly committed to decarbonization. And I think what we are going to see is regulators not really understanding that when they say, gosh, it looks like we're hitting our goals, why don't we go ahead and make it 2%? That the market immediately pops to $250 a LCFS credit. And the regulators say, well, I guess we're going to have to give out some for electricity charging to the utilities just to get the market balanced again. Because regulators, unfortunately, don't have a really good tool to just dial in the exact price. So they have to do it through these increases in LCFS demand, which is what they're doing with these carbon reduction indexes. And so our conversations with CARB are, what are the appropriate times for them to announce that they're going to increase the amount of LCFS credits required? Their current estimation is that a lot of the projects that have been announced will not get built, and that there's 4.2 billion gallons of renewable diesel capacity we know of in the U.S. There's one that's got $9.5 billion budget down in Louisiana, and they just start looking at it in California and shaking their head and saying, we'll see it when it shows up, but it's not going to happen this year or next year. And so we're going to wait and see. So a lot of the capacity announcements are being taken with a grain of salt.
What about, let me just ask you quick before we switch topics a little bit. And we don't have that much. I want to be cognizant of your time, but
okay.
Just quickly, do you get inbounds from other consultants or other states having interest or your ideas of what LCFS in other states? How much is that ramped up?
I serve on the board of directors of the National Renewable Fuels Association, representing all 210 corn ethanol plants and frankly also the entire biodiesel and renewable diesel business. And there is very strong appetite for either a national EPA-driven low carbon fuel standard, and the 13 states that signed with Governor Schwarzenegger, the Western Climate Initiative, they were the governors of 13 states, have already been implementing this. Washington and Oregon already have adopted LCFS. British Columbia and Canada has adopted it in LCFS. And I think that the other 10 Western states will adopt an LCFS, basically from Colorado west. LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard, is a technology neutral mechanism to lower carbon. It doesn't prefer any particular technology or any particular fuel or anything else. By necessity, all it says is use the Argonne Labs 3.0 GREET model, which says how much carbon reduction do you have compared to gasoline if you're displacing gasoline, or diesel if you're displacing diesel. And I don't care if you're using nuclear waste to do it. If you're reducing carbon intensity, we'll pay you the money in the form of a carbon credit. And the folks that are producing too much carbon are the ones that have to buy the credits. So we'll do a cap and then we'll trade it. And over 10 years, we just had our 10-year anniversary in California of the LCFS. This has proven to be a tool that can be relied upon by institutional investors in both debt and equity to fund projects. And that's the goal of this whole thing. If you can't fund projects, all these policies don't mean anything. Even mandates don't mean anything if you can't fund projects. So this has proven to be a tool that can create the attraction of capital into carbon reduction, which is the goal of a national EPA kind of a system.
Just one other question I get several times since over the last couple of days is it's just leverage and the interest rate on the revolver. It's coming due I think next April. Maybe just comment on how you're going to adjust the capital stack.
Sure, not a problem. Starting in 2008, Third Eye Capital started funding our company with some smaller transactions and then scaled up to larger ones. And we have had a successful relationship with them for over, 12 years. They're a bridge loan financer of our company. Now, the fact that we had to move slowly in certain timeframes like COVID, et cetera, makes a bridge loan look like it's high cost financing, but in reality, it's still just a bridge loan. And we have successfully paid them down over $50 million in just the last 6 months, and are well positioned in the second half of this year to do further, not only reductions, but complete refinancings of their various bridge fundings into our projects. We have 15 million of our cash plus 17 million of grants in our renewable diesel project. So it's 32 million of equity in renewable diesel, but our 15 million was all a bridge loan financing, so not dilutive to our shareholders. Most project developers have to go out and sell a big chunk of their company to raise the equity to do whatever they're going to do. We've been able to benefit our shareholders by having that credit facility, and that credit facility is personally guaranteed by me personally, and has been since 2008. And it shows my willingness to internalize some of the capital markets risk of our company while externalizing to our shareholders the benefit. The opportunity of us avoiding dilution in these various projects is very, very high, because otherwise we might have to issue a whole lot of shares like many other companies do as they try to come up with the equity. And that business model just reflects our commitment, our long-term commitment to these projects, and our lenders' partnership with us reflects their commitment as well. What they get is they get a high yield. And we've been successful at performing under that. We've paid them back all of their principal plus a good substantial profit already to date. And we are comfortable that relationship is an excellent asset of the company, even though for any spot in time you'd say, oh my gosh, those bridge loans cost a lot of money. If you're thinking a broader picture, the life cycle of these projects, 30 to 50 years. If you have equity dilution, that means you're giving away 30 to 50 years of cash flow. These interest rates look pretty small to have short-term loans that come out. A last little note is I think we've had 26 amendments to the original note. It's a bridge loan. Yeah. So they never are longer than more than maybe 15 or 18 months, but we've amended them 26 times because they've never been in breach. They just keep on rolling forward in time, but they're intended to be short term because they're intended to be paid off. So with a different view, you'd say, well, isn't that great news? These are going to be reduced over time and replaced with 6% USDA funding, for example, over 20 years. And so that's the business model of the company. It just unfortunately takes a while to do it when you're working through COVID and other things that are external to the company.
That's a great clarification, and I know investors appreciate that. One other thing too is I think of your model as kind of the silver bullet. Did you create the company in this kind of image where, as a producer, you control all of what I call the subsidy economics, whereas you can kind of dole out where you want? Whereas I think that's a key question across the space is, especially further you move downstream, how much of the economics you actually get, and nobody's been very clear about it. So, but when you produce it all, it seems like you can just go where you need to. If you need to sign up a bigger contract, you can give them more of the credit. How that works? Is that a fair way to think about it?
It is a fair way to think about it, and it's a little bit frustrating for some of our friends that are in what I would call the midstream business. Downstream would be to own a actual fueling station or something. Then you have these midstream kind of brokers who come to producers and say, I control downstream, I want to take a margin. And what we're finding is that we just create a tremendous amount of economic value compared to let's say a landfill gas operation. Landfill gas is a positive 30 CI. The metric is 80 minus 30 gives you about 50 CI points. Well, we're at negative 426. You take positive 80 minus negative 46, we generate about 506 LCFS points for every MMBTU. A typical landfill gas is 50. So we're generating 10 times as much cash. That's LCFS is cash. Than a landfill guy with an equivalent volume going into a truck. So you put 1 MMBTU of landfill gas in one truck, you get 10 times as much money if you get it from us. So you're correct that we're actually saying, well, don't we have a whole lot of trucks, like 75 of them a day that come into our own plant? Why don't we put up a retail station and fuel them first? And every time we fuel them, we get $2 of value for the fuel we put into the truck, but we get about $105 from the low carbon fuel standard value and over $35 from the federal value. So we get $140 value from the environmental attributes. We might as well just give away the $2 because any guy that comes by and picks it up from my plant, I'm making $140 and have no brokerage fee, no disintermediation from our customer at all. And the same goes with any local deal we do with any of the local dairies and food producers. And Pepsi's largest North American trucking division is actually in Modesto, probably 10 minutes from where we're at. Amazon, UPS, just go on and on. There's no reason we just don't have direct relationships with the guy that controls the actual fueling station, including ourselves. We have our own fueling station in the third quarter this year. So our view is very long-term. Why would we look out over 10 or 20 years and take 10% of a $180 million business, that's 18 million a year, times 10, that's 180 million, times 20, it's $360 million. What's the value proposition of giving somebody $360 million? Why don't we just take the molecule and put it in a couple of fueling stations and kind of run it ourselves? So we're taking that very, very long-term view. It's harder to do because most producers don't want to think about anything other than just stick in the pipeline, and then it kind of magically disappears. But for $360 million, you can do a lot of fueling stations, or you can do a lot of end user relationships for that kind of money. So that's the way we think about it. We think about it holistically.
That's great. I appreciate it. Just one last one, then we'll cut it off. But institutional ownership, I guess, has doubled or tripled right over the last 2 or 3 months. It's a major shift. What's kind of the number one kind of question or issue that comes from the institutional investors over that time frame?
The number one issue for most people is they would like to see the biogas project steps be more clear, because they're hearing accurate data. It's not inaccurate, that permitting is difficult. It can easily take another 1.5 to 2 years more than what was originally expected, that pipelines are difficult, that it's hard to find somebody that's willing to let you have a county road that you can go dig up and then they have to re-asphalt the thing. That frankly, the materials are more expensive and longer lead time to acquire. So the HDPE pipe and the liner material is difficult to obtain. And then lastly, the contractors are difficult, that labor is in short supply, that has its expertise in pressurized pipelines and H2S removal units, et cetera. My response to that is we already have our permit for the entire 32-mile pipeline. The encroachment permit is perfunctory, and I expect to be able to announce that in the next week or two. We bought the materials in the middle of COVID. We went out in the middle of COVID, fully a year ahead of getting our permits, and bought the materials because it was at a discount. Everybody had stopped building. So we went out, we used our money, our ability to use our bridge financing, put us in a position to buy the materials. So we don't really have, for digesters or any materials exposure over the next year or so. And it's just because we've been planning to do this, not in the last 12 months. We actually closed our equity financing in December of 2018. We signed the term sheet in July of 2018. So this is a business that is closing. We're completing things. We're not starting and hoping to start, doing something. We're completing things, completing the hub, completing the interconnection, completing our fueling station. We're in the completion phase. And where I invite investors to move forward is, frankly, either spend some time in person with me on a Zoom call, or just come on out and walk around. We are hosting institutional investors who manage trillion-dollar funds, at least the renewable parts of those funds. And as they walk around, they say, okay, got it. You're going to be the largest dairy biogas producer in the world with this plan. And I don't see why it's not going to work. Once you put the pipeline in the ground, what other choice do dairies have? There is no second pipeline, and the centralized hub and all the other things are too capital intensive for any single dairy to do. So this is a first mover advantage that starts and ends if you have an ethanol plant. If you don't have an ethanol plant, you can't generate the revenue until all the interconnection is done, and it delays everything by a long, long time. And the permits are very difficult. We have 22 permits that run our plant. We have personal relationships with the people that issue these permits, have had those relationships for 10 years. Unlike a new biogas producer comes into town, we have 10 years of relationship where people are working during COVID, and for other people, they might not get that priority. So I invite a personal relationship with our management team as a solution to these questions of credibility and timing and risk. Just come on out. Just come out and see. We'll show you the pipeline going in the ground. We'll show you actual operations. And I think you'll be comfortable that we should be on the short list of companies that will be here not only for the last 15 years, but for the next 100 years.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate your time, Eric. I know that the people on the call do as well. There's a lot of great information, a lot of great clarity. For those on the call, we are going to have a replay. And then I know Eric is very open to questions and investor engagement. So again, appreciate your time, Eric. And I think that's it for the questions. I know we ran a little bit longer, but I think it was well worth it. So appreciate it. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Call anytime.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.